Step away from the vehicle right now, or I will drag you out myself. The voice came through the loudspeaker mounted on the side of the cruiser, flat, practiced, and unhurried in the particular way of a man who had said those exact words before in this exact county and had never once been told he couldn't. It was the voice of someone who had spent 19 years being the last word on everything, and who had woken up that morning with no reason to believe today would be any different. Nadia Osei did not step away from the vehicle. She kept her hand on the fuel nozzle, kept her eyes on the side mirror, and in that mirror she watched Sheriff Harlan Cobb climb down from his white and brown cruiser with the slow, deliberate weight of a man who had made this exact walk before many times. Many women, many mirrors, just like this one. He had the unhurried patience of someone who believed the outcome was already settled before the conversation began. He had chosen the wrong woman on the wrong afternoon, and he would not understand that for several more minutes yet. The afternoon heat at Brixton fuel stop sat on the skin like a warm, wet compress that had been left too long. Highway 9 outside Harlow, Georgia ran straight and flat in both directions. No shade anywhere, just the shimmer of old asphalt baking under a November sun that hadn't quite gotten the message that summer was supposed to be finished. Nadia had pulled off the interstate at 14 minutes past 2 after 5 hours on the road from Atlanta, the kind of drive that empties the mind if you let it. She had not let it. She never did. Before she opened the door of the black Chevy Traverse, she did what she always did without hesitation, without thought, the same way other people check their mirrors before pulling out of a parking space. She opened the small spiral notebook on the center console. Black cover, the cheap kind sold in packs of 3 at any drugstore for $1, and she wrote in her careful, slightly slanted hand, Brixton Fuel Stop, Highway 9, Harlow, Harlow County, Georgia. 2:47 p.m. Odometer 51,883. She kept the pen. She got out. The gas station was the kind of place that had probably looked tired in 1994 and had simply continued in that direction without apology. 2 pumps under a canopy that sagged at one corner, a hand-painted sign on the door reading, No loitering, management reserves the right, and a general atmosphere of a building that had made its peace with the passage of time by refusing to acknowledge it. But the cameras, one facing the road from a pole near the entrance, one mounted on the pump pillar at eye level, were newer than everything else on the property, noticeably newer, the kind of equipment that cost real money and that someone had specifically decided to spend that money on. Nadia noticed them immediately, the way she noticed everything, and she noted the angle of each lens without stopping or turning her head to look directly at them. She slid her card into the reader, selected regular, lifted the nozzle, and began to pump. Inside the station, through the smudged plate glass window, a man sat behind the counter. He was in his 60s, heavy-set, with a sunburned neck and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he was not reading anything. He was watching her. She had been watching him watch her since the moment she pulled in, the way his head turned from the register to follow the Traverse as she came off the highway and pulled toward the far pump. His name was on the sign above the door, Dwayne Pickett. Brixton Fuel Stop. Established 1993. The kind of sign that is both an introduction and a declaration, this is my property, and by extension, this is my county. He came outside 2 minutes after she started pumping. He walked across the concrete apron with his thumbs in the waistband of his jeans, stopping 8 feet away at the edge of the canopy shadow, and he said, You need help with something, in the tone of a question that did not mean what it was asking. I'm fine, thank you, Nadia said without looking at him. His eyes moved from her face to the Traverse, lingered on the rental company decal on the bumper corner, moved to the out-of-state plate frame, and moved back up. Rental car, he said. Not a question. Yes. Where'd you pick it up? Nadia watched the counter on the pump tick forward. She said nothing. Pickett stood there for another beat, as though the silence itself would eventually become an answer he could use. Then he turned and walked back inside, and she watched him through the window pick up the phone behind the register, watch his mouth begin to move, and watch him turn his back deliberately toward her, so she could not read his lips. The call lasted under 30 seconds. She wrote the time in her notebook, 2:52 p.m. Pickett. Phone call. Turned away. Under 30 seconds. 4 minutes after that, a Harlow County Sheriff's cruiser rolled past the pump island at a speed that was not quite a stop and not quite a pass-through, slow enough to see everything, fast enough to claim it hadn't stopped. The deputy inside looked at her through the passenger window without expression. The cruiser continued east and disappeared around the curve. She wrote 2:56 p.m., Unit 7, Harlow County. Passed east. Did not stop. Driver observed subject. The white and brown cruiser had been parked at the intersection 40 yards north since before she pulled in. She realized this now looking back at what she had been registering in her peripheral vision since she arrived. The engine was idling. The driver had not moved. She replaced the nozzle. She replaced the gas cap. She folded her receipt and put it in her jacket pocket and was reaching for the door handle of the Traverse when the loudspeaker crackled to life. And nothing about the next several hours would go the way Harlan Cobb expected. Sheriff Harlan Cobb was not a tall man, but he had learned a long time ago that height was not the only way to fill a room or a parking lot or a stretch of county highway where there was no one around to tell you that you couldn't. He was wide across the chest and shoulders in the way of someone who had been physically powerful in his 30s and had simply continued forward on the momentum of that memory. The mass still there, the original purpose of it somewhat rearranged. He wore his platinum blonde hair thick and combed straight back beneath a wide-brimmed hat that he kept low on his brow, and his silver star was slightly faded in a way that suggested not neglect but permanence. The badge of a man who had been wearing it so long that it had simply become part of the surface of him. He walked toward Nadia with the measured, unhurried patience of someone who had learned early that pace communicated authority more reliably than volume, and who had spent 19 years refining that understanding. He was carrying a thin manila folder, and he did not look at it once. He looked at her. 19 years. That was how long Harlan Cobb had been the last word on everything that happened in Harlow County, re-elected 4 times in races where his opponents either dropped out before the filing deadline or received so few votes that the margin felt more like a formality than a contest. He had never once been formally written up in the department's internal records, though the county had quietly settled 2 separate use-of-force complaints in the past decade, both times without admitting liability, both times without Cobb's name appearing in any public document. His name was on the dedication plaque outside the county administrative building, engraved there 6 years ago at a ceremony where the county manager called him the backbone of what we stand for out here, and where Dwayne Pickett sat in the front row and applauded with the specific enthusiasm of a man who understood exactly what that sentence meant. Cobb and Pickett had known each other since before Cobb had a badge. They had gone to the same high school 30 miles south of Harlow, had hunted the same land in the years after, and had developed over the decades a particular kind of unspoken understanding, the kind that does not need to be written down because both parties know precisely what it covers and precisely what it will cost to violate it. The arrangement was not complicated. Pickett called when something felt wrong to him, and Cobb came without waiting to be dispatched. It had worked for years. It had worked so reliably that neither of them had ever stopped to consider what might happen if one day the person Pickett called about happened to be someone who already knew the arrangement existed. He stopped 6 feet from Nadia, the same distance he always used, close enough to be unmistakable, far enough to be technically unconfrontational, and he said, "You the operator of this vehicle, I am. License and registration. I'll need to know the basis for the stop first." Sheriff. Her voice was even. Not hostile, not deferential, not performing anything, simply level, in the way a floor is leveled deliberately, structurally, as if being uneven had never been an option, she considered. Something moved across Cobb's face in that moment. Not surprise, exactly, but something close to the cognitive adjustment a person makes when a door they expected to swing open does not move. He had asked that question, or its equivalent, hundreds of times. He had not been asked what gave him the right to ask it. Not in this county, not in this parking lot, not in 19 years. "I'm asking the questions here," he said. "You are," she said. "And I'm asking a procedural one." She let one full beat of silence fall between them, the kind of silence that does not flinch. "I'd like to understand the procedure, Sheriff." He told her about a GCIC flag, Georgia Crime Information Center vehicle status flagged for inquiry as of that morning. She made the distinction between flagged as missing and flagged for inquiry so quickly and so calmly that the folder in his hand actually lowered 1 inch before he caught himself. She offered the rental agreement from the console of the Traverse. He told her he would determine what resolved the inquiry. He took her license without looking at it and went back to his cruiser. She watched his in-car terminal screen from 30 feet away. He typed. He read. He typed again. He picked up the radio handset, spoke into it, listened, set it back down. He was in the cruiser for 4 minutes. When he came back, he said, "Dispatch ran the plate. No active flag." He said it the way people say things that have turned out inconveniently to be true. "But I'm receiving information that this vehicle may have been taken from the rental lot under irregular circumstances." She held out the rental agreement. "The agreement is dated this morning. Enterprise, Atlanta, 6 a.m. pickup. The location and contract number are on the contract." He did not take the agreement. He told her he would need to verify it independently. Nadia looked at him for 3 full seconds, not performing patience, not suppressing anything, just looking the way she had looked at documents and people and courtrooms and county buildings across 4 other states over 9 years of doing this exact kind of work. She had been in rooms that made this parking lot feel like a quiet Tuesday afternoon. She had sat across from men with considerably more power than Harlan Cobb and considerably more sophisticated reasons for the things they did, and she had waited them out with the same unhurried, unblinking attention she was giving him right now. "How would you like to proceed?" she said. Deputy Roy Fenn arrived from the south in a cruiser that parked on the far side of the pump island, and he climbed out with the particular posture of a man in his mid-20s who had practiced looking bored, because boredom in his experience communicated authority more efficiently than alertness did. He was lean, light-haired, and he positioned himself without being told behind and to the right of Cobb, which placed Nadia between both men with approximately 12 feet of open concrete in front of her and a cruiser door at her back. She noted the geometry without turning her head. She had seen this configuration before in different parking lots with different badges, and she understood immediately what it was designed to communicate. Cobb stepped to his left, a deliberate repositioning territorial in the way that had nothing to do with procedure and everything to do with the expansion of what a man considers his space, and told her he was going to ask her to step away from the vehicle while he conducted a visual inspection. "Do you have a warrant?" she asked. "I don't need one for a visual inspection of the exterior." "The exterior," she said, "not the interior." He stopped. The word had landed somewhere specific, and both of them knew it. "Do you have something in the interior you're concerned about?" he said. "I have personal property in the interior. I'm clarifying the scope." Cobb told her to step away from the vehicle. She stepped back 2 paces and kept her hands visible at her sides, fingers open, nothing about her body suggesting anything other than deliberate compliance. Dwayne Pickett had materialized at the edge of the canopy. She registered him in her peripheral vision without turning toward him, standing with his arms crossed and the posture of a man who has already decided how this ends and is simply waiting for the rest of the afternoon to catch up to his conclusion. Pickett walked toward the group after a moment, unhurried and proprietary, the walk of a man entering a room he owns. He stopped beside Cobb and addressed him as though Nadia were not standing 3 feet away. "Harlan," he said, "I'm telling you something's not right here." She came off the interstate wrong. No signal pulled straight to the far pump. "I've been running this station for 24 years. I know what a regular customer looks like." Nadia turned and walked 4 steps to the concrete pillar near the pump. She read the trespass statute posted there. White background, red lettering weathered at the edges but completely legible aloud, word by word, to the three men watching her. "You haven't asked me to leave," she said to Pickett when she had finished reading. "And you haven't waited for me to refuse. Both steps are required by the statute on your own sign." Pickett stared at the sign like he was seeing it for the first time. He looked at Cobb. He looked back at the sign. He unfolded a piece of paper he had apparently carried out from the register, handwritten, wrinkled, and then folded it back up again and said nothing. Cobb invoked the Georgia theft by receiving statute. She cited the dispatch response, "No hold, no flag," received 13 minutes before he arrived on scene, and she told him it would be in his dispatch log. She asked what information he had received in the gap between dispatch clearing her plate and his decision to approach her, and she told him calmly that she believed it had come from a phone call made from this property. He did not answer. Then he reached for the strap of the bag at her left side. Not a strike, not quite a grab, more like a decision made in the moment between intention and action. His right hand closing on the strap and pulling with enough force that the bag jerked on her shoulder. She turned her body with the pull, not resisting, not retreating, simply rotating so that her right hip came between his hand and the bag's contents, and the bag settled back against her side without him having it. "Don't resist," he said, the words coming out too fast, the sharpness in them giving away that he had not expected the move. "I'm not resisting," she said, her voice unchanged. She was looking at the camera on the pump pillar, the one that had been recording since before she pulled in. "I'm standing still. My feet have not moved." Fenn came from her left, his forearm catching her shoulder with enough force to rock her sideways. Her knee hit the running board of the Traverse. She did not fall. She put her hand flat on the side of the car and steadied herself, and then she turned back to face them. "That contact will also be visible on the station camera," she said. Time stamped approximately 3:04 p.m. Fenn took her left arm. Cobb took her right. They walked her to the front of the cruiser. "Hands on the hood," Cobb said, pressing her forward, and she complied deliberately. Hands flat on warm metal. Nothing about her cooperation, accidental or involuntary. She raised her eyes. She looked straight into the camera on the pump pillar. She held that position, hands visible, body still, eyes forward, and that was all she did. Cobb said, "Handcuffs." "I want to note for the record," she said, her voice completely steady against the hood of the cruiser, "that I haven't resisted at any point during this interaction. I am complying with all lawful commands." She glanced at her watch, the movement small and deliberate. "The time is 3:07 p.m. The cuffs went on, not roughly, not gently procedurally. Cobb stepped back. Fenn put his hand on her arm and walked her toward his cruiser. As he opened the rear door, she turned her head and looked at the camera on the pump pillar one final time. She had confirmed the third camera, the hemisphere dome unit mounted under the canopy overhang on the south-facing side when Pickett's shadow fell at a particular angle as he walked toward them. She had not looked directly at it. She didn't need to. 3 cameras. Every approach to the pump island covered. Fenn closed the door. There were 3 other people at Brixton Fuel Stop that afternoon, and none of them would forget what they saw. Though none of them would say a word about it until later, much later, when saying something finally felt less dangerous than staying quiet. The first was Gerald Hooks, 53 years old, a contractor out of Macon who had stopped to fill his work truck on his way back from a job site outside Harlow. He was at the far pump, the one closest to the road, and he had set down the nozzle and turned to watch when Fenn's cruiser pulled in, and the geometry of the situation became clear. He had a daughter who was 41 years old, who drove a nice car, who sometimes drove through counties like this one on her way to visit him, and he stood there holding his phone with both hands and thought about that daughter for approximately 30 seconds before he put the phone back in his pocket without pressing record. He would think about that decision for a long time afterward. The weight of the phone, the reasons he'd told himself, the image of the rental tag on the Traverse bumper, and the way Nadia had kept her hands visible the entire time. The second witness was Destiny, 16 years old, who had stopped her bicycle at the edge of the canopy shadow on her way home from school and stood there with one foot on the ground and one on a pedal, watching in the particular way of a teenager who does not yet have the language for what she is seeing but understands exactly what it feels like. She watched Fenn's forearm hit Nadia's shoulder. She watched the knee against the running board. She watched Nadia's hands go flat on the hood of the cruiser, and she watched Nadia look straight into the camera on the pump pillar like she was speaking directly into it. Destiny did not have the kind of experience that would have told her what to do with what she was watching. But she had enough instinct to understand that what she was watching was not right, and that the cameras were there, and that those two facts were connected in a way she couldn't quite articulate yet. She took out her phone. She did not film the arrest. She photographed the camera on the pump pillar. Then she photographed the dome unit under the canopy. She had to look twice to find it tucked up in the overhang. But she found it, and she stood there for another moment thinking before she got back on her bicycle and rode home. She did not delete the photographs. The third witness was a woman in a gray minivan. Her name was Sandra, and she had 2 kids in the back seat who were arguing about something involving a bag of chips. And she rolled her window up when the cruisers arrived and looked straight ahead at the road and told herself that she did not know what was happening, and that it was not her business, and that the children needed to get home for dinner, and she drove away before the cuffs were on. She would think about the woman's hands on the hood for the next 3 days without being able to explain to herself why the image kept coming back. Dwayne Pickett watched from the doorway of his station, arms folded in the posture of a man who considers himself vindicated. He did not look at the pump pillar camera. He did not think about the dome camera under the canopy because he had stopped thinking about that camera years ago. It had simply become part of the infrastructure, like the sagging corner of the canopy, a feature of the place that you stop registering after enough time passes. Fenn closed the rear door of the cruiser. The last thing Nadia saw through the window as the cruiser pulled away was Destiny still standing at the edge of the canopy shadow, with her bicycle looking up at the pump pillar camera, and then down at her phone, and then back up at the camera again, with the specific focus of a 16-year-old who has just decided that something matters and is trying to figure out what to do with that decision. The cruiser turned onto Highway 9 and headed toward the county administrative building. Pickett went back inside. Gerald Hook stood at his truck for a moment longer, then drove away without saying anything to anyone. Not yet. The Harlow County Administrative Building was a low 2-story structure on the main road through Harlow that communicated civic authority primarily through the size of its gold-lettered sign, rather than through anything about its architecture, which was 1970s brick gone gray at the seams and entirely unremarkable. They brought Nadia in through the side entrance, the one with the keypad lock and the camera above the door and no windows. And the processing was handled by a woman at a desk who did not look at Nadia once during the entire procedure, reading the intake questions from a printed form and writing down the answers without lifting her eyes from the paper. Name, date of birth, address. Nadia's phone went into a clear plastic bag. Her jacket, her belt. Her notebook went in last, and she watched it go. Watched the clerk pick it up with 2 fingers, set it on the scale, write the weight on the bag label, and she tracked the bag to the shelf without turning her head after it. She was taken to a holding room that was technically not a cell because it had no bars, a distinction that served the department more than it served her. There was a table, 2 chairs, and a window that faced the parking lot. The door had a lock, but no bars, because there were no charges, yet filing charges required paperwork, and paperwork required time, and time was the buffer that allowed the sheriff's office to hold a person in a room with a lock without technically booking them. She understood this immediately, the same way she understood most things that happened in county buildings. She sat in the chair facing the door. She did not pace. She folded her hands on the table and she began from memory to reconstruct everything she had seen and recorded and observed and stored since the moment she pulled off the interstate. The rental agreement contract number, pickup location, return date, vehicle description, driver name, she could recite every line of it. The voluntary cooperation form that Fenn had produced from inside his jacket and placed on the hood of the Travers, which she had read completely before declining to sign, She could quote line 5 verbatim, the one that would have acknowledged that the vehicle's documentation may be incomplete and consented to the statement being used in any subsequent legal proceeding. Fenn's notebook, she had read the angle of his pen from 3 feet away and understood that he was writing a version of events in which her refusal to cooperate preceded rather than followed Cobb's decision to approach her. The dispatch response, no hold, no flag received at approximately 2:44 p.m., 13 minutes before Cobb arrived on scene. What had filled those 13 minutes she already knew. She knew the timestamp on the station camera would show Pickett going back inside at 2:52 p.m. She knew what a call of under 30 seconds could arrange between two men who had had the same arrangement for 20 years and no longer needed to explain it to each other. She had documented calls like that before from offices considerably quieter than a rural gas station, and those calls had collapsed arrangements that had been holding together for far longer than anyone on the outside had suspected. She sat with her hands folded, and she waited. The shift changed at 5 o'clock. She heard new voices in the hallway, the specific register of people arriving replacing the register of people leaving, and footsteps at door, the distant sound of a phone ringing twice and stopping. At 5:47 p.m., the holding room door opened and a young deputy came in with a paper cup of water. He was 22, maybe 23, with a training patch still on his left shoulder, the temporary designation that hadn't yet been replaced by a permanent unit number, and he set the cup on the table without meeting her eyes. He was turning back toward the door when he stopped. He turned around. His voice was pitched low-shaped to stay inside the room and not carry past the door. "Miss Osei. Not ma'am. Not the subject. Her name carefully the way you say a name when you understand what's attached to it. Your attorney called the desk. He's on his way. He was 22 years old, and he had the particular expression of someone who had recently understood something he very much wished he had not understood." "Thank you," she said. He left. The lock engaged. She picked up the paper cup of water and drank half of it and set it back down and looked at the door, and she thought about the way he had said her name, Miss Osei, like it was a small act of respect in a room that hadn't offered her many. Jerome Albright arrived at 5:45 p.m., and Nadia heard him before she saw him, the specific cadence of a lawyer building his case in a hallway, not raised, not theatrical, but with the layered certainty of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where confidence about procedure was more useful than volume. She couldn't hear the words through the door, but she could hear the effect of them, a pause, a drawer opening a different door. Albright had been practicing civil rights law since before some of the deputies in this building were born, and he had long since learned that the most efficient way to move through an administrative system was to speak its language back to it with more precision than it expected. He was 58 silver at the temples with the compact stillness of a person who had learned that stillness is power in rooms where everyone else is performing urgency. He set his case on the table, looked at her, and then looked at the surface of the table. No notebook, no phone, no paper. "They took your notebook. It'll be back within the hour." He sat down across from her. "Are you injured?" Fenn's forearm made contact with my left shoulder. My knee hit the running board of the traverse. "Neither is significant." He looked at her for a moment. "How do you know about Fenn?" "I've been watching how things work in this county for longer than this afternoon." He opened the case. "Tell me what you have." She told him all of it in sequence, without pause, without editorial, beginning with the moment she pulled off the interstate and ending with the holding room door clicking shut behind the young trainee deputy who had brought her water and said her name correctly. She gave him every timestamp, every document description, every camera position, every detail of Cobb's dispatch log, and the 13-minute gap, and Pickett's phone call, and the angle of Fenn's pen in his notebook. All of it in the order it had happened, with the economy of language that comes from years of writing reports where every word either bears weight or doesn't belong. When she finished, Albright had not written a single thing. He had been watching her face. The dispatch log showed a clean response at 2:44, he said. Yes, Cobb was on scene at 2:57, 13-minute gap. He nodded, but he was already reaching into the case, producing a folder with a stamp on the cover dated 7 weeks earlier. not recent. The ink slightly faded, the paper carrying the particular smell of a document that had been handled and rehandled many times. He laid it on the table and turned it so she could read the cover. The folder contained a summary document. She scanned the first page, then read it more slowly. 14 documented incidents at or near Brixton fuel stop over a 5-year period. Single women rental vehicles or newer model personal cars stopped within 2 miles of the station. 9 of the 14 contacts had been made by Cobb personally. In 6 cases, Deputy Fenn or his predecessor had been present for the detention. 3 criminal charges had been filed. All 3 had been dismissed within 60 days, not for innocence, but for insufficient evidence because in all 3 cases the paperwork had developed problems, timeline inconsistencies, documents that didn't match dispatch logs, evidence that had been logged incorrectly or not at all. She looked up. You knew. It was not an accusation. It was a confirmation the way you confirm something you already more than suspected and are simply now seeing the proof of. We've been building this for 8 months, he said. The field assessment was already underway. You were not supposed to become the subject of an incident you were supposed to be driving through. Pickett called Cobb before I could leave. The window was 3 minutes. I was almost out. Albright repeated the word with the weight of a man who had seen too many almosts. Almost. He reached into the case a second time and produced a second folder, thinner, newer paper, the ink still sharp. He placed it on the table. We might, he said carefully, have the phone call covered. She looked at the folder. She looked at him. The call to Cobb's personal cell at 2:53 p.m. He explained the carrier log showed a 2-minute 31-second call from the Brixton fuel stop landline. That was on record. But the station also had a second line, a back office line, that Pickett used for what he called administrative purposes. And that line had a voicemail system that auto-recorded outgoing messages when the recipient's phone went to voicemail first. Cobb's phone went to voicemail before the call connected. Pickett left a message, then Cobb called back. Albright opened the folder. This is the transcript. She read it. She read it again, slowly, with the same careful attention she gave to every document she had ever been handed in every county building across 4 states. Then she set the paper flat on the table and did not speak for a moment. That she said changes everything. Albright did not smile. Lawyers who had done this long enough did not smile at moments like this one. They nodded one measured degree of acknowledgement the way a level finds its mark when you have finally gotten the surface exactly right. We have a filing to make, he said. They released her the next morning at 7:15. Not because the charges had been resolved, but because they had not yet been filed, and filing them required paperwork that no one in the building that morning appeared to be in any particular hurry to complete. The officer who came to get her was not Fenn, not anyone from the previous shift. A younger man with careful eyes who seemed to understand that the air in this particular hallway had a specific quality to it that morning, and was choosing his words with that understanding in mind. Her notebook was on the table outside the holding room. Her phone, her jacket, her belt. She checked each item with the same deliberate attention she used for everything, and when she reached the end of the table, she stopped. The rental agreement was not there. She asked. The officer checked one list, then a second list, then made a phone call that lasted 2 minutes, came back, and said that Deputy Fenn had noted the rental agreement as held for evidentiary purposes. What's the log entry number? She asked. He checked. He came back. There isn't one listed. She looked at him not with accusation, just with the particular quality of attention that makes a person suddenly aware of exactly what their own words mean, and she asked for a copy of the intake property log from her processing the night before. He made her wait 17 minutes. He came back with a single printed sheet. She read it in full. The rental agreement. Enterprise Contract EA-2024-4 41892. The document she had offered Cobb twice in the first 10 minutes of the stop. The document she had watched Fenn fold once and place in the left breast pocket of his uniform shirt, at exactly 2:59 p.m., was not on the intake property log as personal property. It was not listed in the evidence log. It had not been attached to the incident report. Between Fenn's shirt pocket and the shelf in the intake room, it had simply ceased to exist in any official record that the Harlow County Sheriff's Office maintained. She folded the intake property sheet twice and put it in her jacket pocket. She picked up her notebook. She walked out. Outside, the morning was cool and gray in the specific way of a Georgia November that had finally decided to commit to the season. Her Traverse was in the facility lot, returned at some point after midnight, after a duty sergeant had apparently insisted with enough persistence that someone had driven it over from the gas station. She sat in the driver's seat. She did not start the engine. She opened the notebook. She turned to a fresh page, and in her careful, slightly slanted hand, she wrote the date and the time. She wrote rental agreement not logged, not in personal property, not in evidence. Fenn's pocket as of 2:59 p.m. November 9th. Not present in department record. She wrote Pickett voicemail transcript confirmed by Albright. 11 seconds. She wrote 3 cameras. Station footage not yet requested by department. Then she wrote one more line, just one, and capped the pen. They don't know what I have. She started the engine. She pulled out of the Harlow County Administrative Building parking lot and turned south on Highway 9 toward the gas station, and she drove past it at exactly the speed limit with her hands at 10 and 2, not stopping, not slowing, just driving past at the speed the road required. And she looked at the camera on the pump pillar as she passed the one with the clear angle on the approaching lane, the one that had been recording since 14 minutes past 2 the previous afternoon. She looked at it. She drove past. She picked up her phone. It rang twice. File the complaint, she said when Albright answered. Harlow County Sheriff's Office. Formal. Today. A pause. Then. The second part, the broader assessment. It's still running. I know. She kept her eyes on the road ahead of her. Straight and flat, the same highway that ran through every county like this one all the way back to Atlanta and beyond. But today gave us enough for the first part. File it. Another pause, and then Albright said, Tamara, and she recognized immediately that he had used the wrong name, caught himself, corrected it. Nadia. The voicemail. Cobb doesn't know Pickett left one. No. When we use it, they'll coordinate their stories before they know what we've got. She had already worked through this in the holding room with her hands folded on the table. That's why we don't show it at the complaint stage. We show it at the hearing. A silence. How long have you been doing this? He asked. She watched the Georgia road run straight ahead of her. Long and empty and familiar. Long enough, she said, to know how to wait. 6 weeks passed, the way weeks pass in small counties, slowly at the surface with considerable movement underneath. Nadia had driven back to Atlanta the morning of November 10th, returned the Traverse to the Enterprise lot at Hartsfield-Jackson, and noted the odometer in her notebook before she signed the return paperwork, and took a cab to the parking garage on Peachtree Center Avenue, where her own car had been waiting since before dawn on the 9th. She had not told anyone at the garage where she was going. She had not needed to. What her office knew was contained in a single classified memorandum dated October 3rd, 7 weeks before she had pulled off Interstate 16 at the Harlow exit. An authorization to conduct a preliminary field assessment of reported civil rights pattern violations in Harlow County, Georgia, under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, and in coordination with the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. The memo did not specify that she would stop at Brixton Fuel Stop. It did not need to. The only gas station between the interstate and the county seat of Harlow was Brixton Fuel Stop, and it had been that way for 9 years since the BP on the north end of town had closed and never been replaced, a fact that Dwayne Pickett had apparently followed with some interest at the time, according to the preliminary file, which was thorough in the way that 8 months of careful, detailed work by a team of people who knew what they were looking for tends to be thorough. The preliminary file had been assembled by 4 people: a data analyst in Atlanta, an investigator based in Savannah, a retired civil rights attorney who had been watching Harlow County specifically since 2020, and Nadia herself, who had been coordinating the effort since the previous spring, and who had driven past the Brixton fuel stop twice in the previous 4 months on what she had listed in her travel records simply as route assessment. The file had 14 documented incidents, 14 women single drivers, rental vehicles, or newer personal cars stopped within 2 miles of Pickett Station over a 5-year period. The demographics were not random. The involvement of Harlan Cobb was not occasional, not circumstantial. It was, as the preliminary file described it in the language available to federal assessors who cannot yet use the word criminal, deeply embedded in the operational patterns of the Harlow County Sheriff's Office. What the file had lacked until the afternoon of November 9th was a witness who had been inside an incident, someone who had felt the weight of Cobb's hand on their property and simultaneously been writing down every second of it. Now it had that. The internal affairs complaint, I-2024-0461, was assigned to Captain Denise Holt, who had transferred to the Harlow County Sheriff's Office from a neighboring county 4 years earlier after a departmental restructuring that was officially called a reorganization and unofficially understood to be the result of 2 use-of-force settlements in 18 months. She was meticulous, careful, and fully aware of the political architecture of a rural county where the sheriff's budget was approved annually by a 5-member board of supervisors, 2 of whom had known Harlan Cobb since before he ran for his first term. She called Albright on November 15th. She told him the complaint was being treated as a formal matter and that an investigative file was being opened. She mentioned the body cam footage from Deputy Fenn's unit she was pulling it that day. Albright told her she would want the download timestamp and the chain of custody documentation from the department's IT specialist. A pause. "How do you have that information?" "My client is thorough," Albright said. Meanwhile, on the other side of Harlow County, in a small office at the Harlow County Ledger, a reporter named Clea Marsh had been working a related story entirely independently for 3 months, arriving at the same wall from a completely different direction. She had filed a public records request in August after a source in the state AG's office mentioned offhandedly that Harlow County had an unusual ratio of dismissals on vehicle-related theft charges. 3 charges filed in 2 years, all 3 dismissed, all 3 defendants, black women between the ages of 31 and 52, all 3 stops within 2 miles of the same gas station on Highway 9. Marsh had pulled the court records herself. She had driven to Harlow in September and sat in the parking lot of the county administrative building for an hour and a half drinking coffee from a gas station on the north end of town and writing in her narrow reporter's notebook. She had knocked on 2 doors and been turned away from both. She had filed a second records request that was still pending. She did not know about Nadia. Nadia did not know about Marsh. They were building toward the same wall from opposite sides, and neither of them knew yet that what was holding the wall up was 11 seconds of audio on a phone carrier's server that Dwayne Pickett had left there by accident, in the absolute certainty that it would disappear. It had not disappeared. It was waiting the way the things you leave behind always wait patiently, without urgency, in exactly the place you left them. The formal disciplinary hearing was scheduled for March 4th, and the notification letters went out on February 14th, which Albright noted was either an administrative oversight or a very particular sense of humor on someone's part. The hearing would be chaired by Captain Holt, with 2 additional IIA officers from outside Harlow County, a procedural requirement that was triggered automatically when the subject of the complaint held the rank of sheriff, ensuring that the panel could not be composed entirely of people who worked in the same building as the man being investigated. Cobb's union attorney, Pete Dunmore, a heavy-set man in his 60s who had represented Harlow County law enforcement in administrative proceedings for 22 years and had won the majority of them, filed 3 pre-hearing motions in the 6 weeks before the hearing date, each one designed to limit the evidentiary scope of what the panel would be allowed to consider. The first motion sought to exclude the carrier log of the picket voicemail on the grounds that it had not been obtained through proper discovery channels. Captain Holt denied it. The log was a matter of public carrier record, not a privileged communication, and Albright had obtained it through a lawful request. The second motion sought to limit testimony to events that the complainant had directly witnessed. Captain Holt denied it. The hearing was an administrative proceeding, not a criminal trial, and the panel had broad latitude to review documentary evidence relevant to the complaint. The third motion, filed on February 28th, 6 days before the hearing, sought a 60-day continuance on the grounds that the respondent needed additional time to prepare an adequate response. Captain Holt denied it. Cobb had been on administrative leave with pay since December 19th. The county manager's office had announced the suspension in a 2-paragraph statement that used the phrase precautionary measure twice and the word misconduct 0 times. Deputy Fenn had been placed on administrative leave without pay the following day, and his union had filed a grievance within 48 hours. Councilman Ray Doyle, whose office had apparently been monitoring the situation since the complaint was filed, issued a public statement expressing full confidence in the county's investigative process and subsequently stopped returning calls from Clea Marsh, who was, by this point, working a story that had grown considerably larger than the one she had started in August. Nadia drove back to Harlow on the morning of March 3rd, staying overnight at a motel in a neighboring town because there was no motel in Harlow. She drove the 40 minutes to the administrative building the following morning with the heat on low and the radio off. She wore a charcoal blazer, dark slacks, flat shoes, no jewelry except a watch. She carried a single professional case, rectangular handled, the same model she had carried into 4 other states over 9 years of doing this work. Albright met her in the parking lot at 8:45. He fell into step beside her without preamble. The AG's office sent an observer. Patricia Odom, Civil Rights Unit. She's not participating, just watching. Nadia absorbed this. Good. It also means whatever happens in that room today goes directly back to the AG. I know. She kept walking. The building's gold-lettered sign caught the early March light. That's why it matters what happens in that room today. The hearing room was not large, a rectangle of institutional carpet and fluorescent light, a long table on the panel side with 7 chairs. Holt in the center, and the 2 external IIA officers flanking her, the county attorney at the far right end. On the respondent's side of the room sat Cobb and Fenn and Pete Dunmore, who had a legal pad in front of him, and the expression of a man who had read all the documents and understood that he was going to need to perform confidence more carefully than he had in most previous hearings. Nadia and Albright sat at the complainant's table to the left. Patricia Odom, the AG's observer. A woman in her early 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and a yellow legal pad sat in a chair against the wall behind and to the right of Nadia, her pen resting on the pad not yet used. The gallery held 3 chairs. Clea Marsh occupied one of them. She had obtained the hearing notice through a public records request and had apparently driven from Harlow the night before, staying at the same motel in the neighboring town without knowing that Nadia was 2 doors down. She had her narrow reporter's notebook open on her knee, the wire spiral at the top, and she was already writing. Holt called the hearing to order at 9:02 a.m. precisely. She read the formal language into the record complaint number, IA-2024-0461 complainant. Nadia Osei respondents. Sheriff Harlan Cobb and Deputy Roy Fenn, Harlow County Sheriff's Office. The hearing was being recorded. All parties were advised that the record might be used in subsequent proceedings. Dunmore opened his mouth. Holt looked at him. He closed it. Albright stood. He spoke for 11 minutes, not long, not short, exactly the length required to lay a foundation without editorializing, to give the panel what it needed to follow the documentation without telling them what to conclude from it. He outlined the November 9th incident in sequence. He identified the documents they would introduce. He named the statutes the Georgia theft by receiving statute Cobb had cited as his basis for detention, the Georgia trespass statute posted on Pickett's own sign, and 18 U.S.C. Section 242, the federal statute governing the deprivation of rights under color of law. When he cited the federal statute, Patricia Odom picked up her pen, and it did not stop moving for the remainder of the morning. Then Albright sat down, and Holt looked toward the complainant's table and said, "Miss Osei, you've been sworn. Please present the documentation relevant to your complaint." Nadia stood. She opened the case. She removed the documents, each one in a labeled sleeve, each with a chain of custody notation on the cover page, and set them on the table in front of her with the methodical precision of someone who has spent years understanding that the way you handle a document in a room like this one is itself a form of testimony. She looked at the panel, Holt, the two external officers, the county attorney, and then she began. The external II. A officers were already writing. The county attorney had the particular quality of stillness that comes from reading something and understanding that the situation has become considerably more complicated than the pre-hearing briefing had suggested it would be. Dunmore had his pen in his hand but had not yet opened his legal pad. Fenn was looking at the wall to his left, a fixed point he had apparently selected as the place where his attention needed to be for the duration of the morning. Cobb was looking at the surface of the table in front of him. His hands were flat on the wood, motionless, and in the particular quality of his stillness, not the confident stillness of a man waiting to be vindicated, but the hollow stillness of a man who has begun to understand the mathematics of his situation. You could see the 19 years beginning to shift like a foundation that has been solid for so long that no one thought to check it, and that is now quietly starting to move. If you're finding this story worth your time, please consider subscribing to our channel. We tell stories that need to be told every week. She began with the rental agreement, and she presented it the way she presented everything. Not performing, not pausing for effect, simply placing each item where it needed to be, and speaking its meaning into the record in language that was exact and unadorned and impossible to misinterpret. Enterprise Rent-A-Car Contract Number, E-202-4-4-41892, she said, setting the document in its labeled sleeve on the table. Pickup location, Hartsfield-Jackson, Atlanta International Airport, 6 a.m., November 9th. Return date November 11th. Vehicle 2024, Chevrolet Traverse, black plate, HRW 771. Driver Nadia A. Osei. She set the document down. This agreement was in my possession at 2:59 p.m. on November 9th at Brixton Fuel Stop, Highway 9 Harlow. I offered it voluntarily to Sheriff Cobb approximately 15 minutes before that at approximately 2:46 p.m. He declined to accept it. Deputy Fenn took possession of it at 2:59 p.m. as Sheriff Cobb directed him to process the arrest. Deputy Fenn did not provide a receipt. He did not log it as personal property. He did not log it as evidence. She set the intake property log beside the rental agreement, her copy the one she had obtained on the morning of November 10th before leaving the building. This is the intake property log from my processing on the night of November 9th, time-stamped 1847. The rental agreement is not on it, Dunmore said. Objection. Chain of custody for that log, Holt said, overruled. The document was produced by this department's own administrative staff. Continue. The second document, the dispatch log. She set it on the table. Harlow County Sheriff's Office, dispatch log case reference DL-2024-11091. Timestamp 1444, that is 2:44 p.m. Query plate HRW 771. Response, no hold, no flag. Registered to Enterprise Rent-A-Car, Atlanta, Georgia. She looked at the panel. This response was transmitted to Sheriff Cobb's in-car terminal before he left his parked position at the intersection of Highway 9 and Route 6. Sheriff Cobb arrived at my location at 2:57 p.m., 13 minutes after dispatch returned a clean result. She placed the incident report beside the dispatch log. Sheriff Cobb's incident report states that the vehicle status was, and I am quoting directly, unclear at time of contact. The dispatch log shows the plate was clear 13 minutes before contact, both documents side by side. The panel read them. The county attorney wrote something on his notepad and then stopped writing and looked at what he had written. The third document, the carrier record. She set it down. Telephone carrier record, November 9th. Call from Brixton Fuel Stop landline registered to Dwayne Pickett Highway 9. Harlow to personal cell phone registered to Sheriff Cordell Harlan Cobb. Time 2:53 p.m. Duration 2 minutes 31 seconds. She paused. 4 minutes before that call at 2:49 p.m. Mr. Pickett placed a separate call to Harlow County Dispatch. She placed the dispatch log beside the carrier record. I have that dispatch log here. The Harlow County dispatcher asked Mr. Pickett whether he could articulate a specific concern about the vehicle or its operator. The dispatch log records his response as follows. She read it aloud. It just don't sit right. She don't belong here. The dispatcher's note reads, caller unable to articulate probable cause. She set the documents side by side, 3 of them now, each one interlocking with the next in a sequence that had its own internal logic, the kind of logic that does not require interpretation, because it simply describes what happened in the order that it happened. Sheriff Cobb arrived on scene 13 minutes after dispatch returned. A clean plate response, she said, and 4 minutes after a personal phone call from the property owner. The stop was not initiated through dispatch. Dunmore objected. The personal call had no established content, he said. She was speculating about its purpose. Holt noted it. The panel would weigh the circumstantial nature of the carrier record. The objection was overruled. The fourth document, the body cam footage. She set the authentication package on the table. Deputy Roy Fenn, body cam unit BW Flex 4, badge number 0847, downloaded from the department server on the evening of November 9th by IT Specialist Aaron Briggs. Chain of custody number COC-2024-0847, authenticated by Briggs's digital signature in the department's evidence management system. She placed the screenshot printed labeled time-stamped chain of custody notation on the cover on the table in front of the panel. At timestamp 14:59 to 59 p.m., the rental agreement is visible in Deputy Fenn's left hand. He folds it once and places it in the left breast pocket of his uniform shirt. She let that sit for a moment. In no subsequent frame of the available footage does the agreement exit that pocket, enter a department evidence bag, or appear in any property or evidence log. The screenshot showed Fenn's hand, the folded document, the pocket. It was clear. It was time-stamped. It was authenticated. There was nothing ambiguous about any of it. Fenn had moved his eyes from the fixed point on the wall to the surface of the table in front of him. Cobb's hands were still flat on the wood, but the knuckles had gone slightly white in a way they hadn't been when the hearing started. Dunmore was writing on his legal pad with the rapid, compressed strokes of a man building a response on the fly. She reached for the fifth document. The room did not yet know what was coming, but something in the quality of Holt's stillness, the way the captain's pen had stopped moving and her eyes had fixed on Nadia's hands, suggested that Holt was already beginning to understand. She set the fifth document on the table with the same unhurried level movement she had used for every document that came before it. No pause, no ceremony, no adjustment of the body that would suggest this one was different from the others. It was placed. It was there. She let it sit for 3 seconds before she spoke. At 2:53 p.m. on November 9th, she said Dwayne Pickett called Sheriff Cobb's personal cell phone. Sheriff Cobb's phone went to voicemail before the call connected. Mr. Pickett left a message. She did not vary her tone. The message was 11 seconds in duration. It was preserved in the telephone carrier's server as an undeleted voicemail on Sheriff Cobb's account. It was obtained through a lawful carrier records request filed by counsel. She picked up the document. The transcript reads as follows. She read it aloud, word by word, in the same even register she had used for the dispatch log and the intake property sheet and every other document in the case, as though the words themselves required no inflection to carry their meaning, because they did not. Harlan. It's Dwayne. Got a situation. Black woman, nice SUV rental tag. Been here about 4 minutes. Don't look like she belongs. Come look before she gets back on the road. Don't send nobody else." She set the paper down. She repeated 3 words without inflection, without emphasis, simply as a restatement of what the record contained: "Don't send nobody else." The room did not move. Not a chair, not a pen, not a breath that anyone was willing to let be heard. "Sheriff Cobb was not dispatched to Brixton Fuel Stop," she said. "He was personally requested by Dwayne Pickett 4 minutes before Pickett's own call to County Dispatch. The voicemail was left at 2:53 p.m., 13 minutes before Cobb's first contact with me." The only articulable characteristic of the situation that Mr. Pickett described in that message was a black woman in an unfamiliar vehicle who had been at his gas station for approximately 4 minutes. She looked at the panel. "That message is what filled the 13-minute gap between dispatch clearing my plate and Sheriff Cobb arriving on scene." She sat down. Patricia Odom's pen had been moving in long, rapid strokes across the yellow legal pad for the past 5 minutes. She did not look up. She kept writing. Holt looked at the transcript. She looked at the carrier record authentication. She looked at the chain of custody documentation. She looked at the 2 external IIA officers, both of whom were writing with the focused attention of people who understand that they are looking at something they will be talking about for a long time. Then she looked at Dunmore. Mr. Dunmore. Dunmore had gone a very particular color, not red, not pale, but the specific intermediate shade that comes from a combination of anger and the dawning recognition that anger is not a useful response to what has just happened. He raised a procedural objection about the authenticity of the transcript. Holt overruled it. The authenticity was established by the carrier record, the authentication chain, and the timestamp, and she had already denied the pre-hearing motion on that grounds. Dunmore went for 20 minutes. He argued that informal community contacts were a routine part of rural law enforcement, that unclear was a reasonable characterization of a vehicle status when an active inquiry had been communicated by a community member, and that Fenn's handling of the rental agreement was a documentation error rather than deliberate concealment. He used the word routine 7 times. He used the phrase professional judgment 4 times. He did not address the voicemail. He returned to his seat. Holt said, "Mr. Dunmore, the voicemail transcript. You haven't addressed it." He looked up from his legal pad. "I denied the authenticity objection before the hearing. I overruled it again this morning. The transcript is in the record." Her voice had the particular patience of a person for whom patience has become a form of pressure. "Do you have a substantive response to the content?" Dunmore looked at Cobb. Cobb was looking at the table. He had been looking at the table without interruption for 11 minutes. Sheriff Cobb exercised professional judgment in response to a community member's concern, Dunmore said. Holt looked at him for a moment. The community member's concern, as documented in a preserved voicemail in the respondent's own carrier account, was that a black woman in a rental vehicle had been at his gas station for approximately 4 minutes. She paused, not for effect, simply because the next sentence required its own space. "Is that the professional judgment you're describing?" Dunmore said that was a characterization. Holt said, "It is a transcript." Cobb spoke once during the hearing unprompted during the afternoon recess in a hallway he had apparently expected to find empty. Nadia was there when he came through the stairwell door. He stopped. 6 feet between them, the same distance as the gas station pump island, and he stood there without his hat, which made him somehow both larger and smaller. At once, the way a man looks when you remove the symbol of authority and see only the person who has been carrying it. And he had the expression of a man who had spent 4 months beginning to understand the geometry of what was happening to him and who had not yet found any version of peace with it. "I was doing my job," he said. "Not to start a conversation, not to open a debate, to say it into existence out loud in front of a witness, to have it heard." She looked at him for a moment in the same way she had looked at him at the gas station, not hostile, not cold, simply clear. "I know you believe that," she said. She walked back into the hearing room. He stayed in the hallway and the door closed behind her, and the afternoon session began without him for 4 minutes until he found his way back to his chair. The afternoon session was primarily documentation review, and it had the particular quality of a proceeding in which most of the significant work has already been done, and what remains is the careful, necessary labor of making the record complete. Holt and the panel went through each submitted item methodically. They asked Nadia 2 clarifying questions, both about timestamps, and she answered both without reference to notes from memory, with the same precision she had used all morning. One of the external IIA officers stopped writing and looked at her for a moment when she did this with an expression she had seen before in rooms like this one. The specific recalibration of a person who has just understood something about the person across from them that they had not understood before. Then Holt called Fenn. He sat at the witness table in civilian clothes. He was on administrative leave. No uniform, and he looked like a man who had spent months preparing for this conversation and had arrived at the conclusion somewhere in the parking lot outside that preparation had not been sufficient. Deputy Fenn Holt said the rental agreement for Enterprise Contract EA-2024-441892. "Where is that document? I logged it with the incident report," Fenn said. "The incident report for November 9th is in this packet." Holt held up the folder. "The rental agreement is not attached to it, referenced in it, or listed in its evidence log. What is the document number under which it was separately filed?" A pause. Fenn looked at his union attorney, a younger man who had taken the administrative side of the case while Dunmore handled Cobb, and the attorney looked at his notes and said that they might need additional time to locate the specific filing number. Holt set down the folder. "The document was placed in your shirt pocket at 2:59 p.m. on November 9th. That action is visible on your own body cam footage. Where is the document now?" Fenn said, "I don't specifically recall the exact disposition of every document from that day." The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when a sentence has just been said that everyone present recognizes as the kind of sentence that will be in a document for a very long time. Nadia was looking at her own hands folded on the table in front of her. She was not looking at Fenn. She did not need to. Holt wrote something. She wrote for a long time, her pen moving steadily across the page. And when she set the pen down, she looked at the 2 external officers, and both of them nodded a small, contained movement that communicated without words that they had seen what they had needed to see. "We'll take a brief recess," Holt said. The recess lasted 43 minutes. When Holt came back into the hearing room, she had a different quality of stillness, the kind that precedes specific language. The kind that comes after a panel has sat in a small side room and reached a conclusion that the evidence had been pointing toward for several hours. She gathered her papers. She looked at the panel members, then at the room. "The panel has reviewed all submitted documentation," she said. "We have preliminary findings to share for the record with the understanding that the formal written determination will follow within 14 days. Regarding Deputy Roy Fenn Holt said, and the room went the kind of quiet that happens when people who have been waiting for something finally understand it has arrived. The panel finds credible evidence of a failure to properly document and preserve a piece of evidentiary material, specifically the rental agreement for Enterprise Contract E-2024-441892, in violation of Department Evidence Handling Protocol Section 4.2 of the Harlow County Sheriff's Office Administrative Manual. The panel also notes a discrepancy between Deputy Fenn's incident report and the dispatch log that requires further examination. Deputy Fenn is to remain on administrative leave without pay pending the formal written determination and any subsequent proceedings. Fenn's union attorney wrote with the rapid focus of a man calculating distances. Regarding Sheriff Harlan Cobb, Holt continued, her voice unchanged level, procedural, the voice of someone reading from an internal document even when they were not reading from one. The panel finds credible evidence that Sheriff Cobb responded to a community member's informal personal request rather than a dispatched call, and that the articulable basis for that request, as evidenced by the carrier voicemail transcript, authenticated and entered into evidence this morning, did not include any specific lawful basis for contact beyond the race of the person observed. She paused, not for theater, because the next sentence needed its own space. The panel further finds that Sheriff Cobb's characterization of the vehicle's status as unclear in his incident report is inconsistent with the dispatch log showing a clear no-hold, no-flag response received 13 minutes prior to first contact. She set the page down on the table in front of her. Sheriff Cobb will remain on administrative leave with pay pending the formal written determination. The panel is referring this matter to the Harlow County Board of Supervisors for independent review and to the Civil Rights Unit of the Georgia Attorney General's office for their consideration. Patricia Odom against the wall wrote 3 lines on her yellow legal pad and underlined one of them. She did not look up. This hearing is adjourned. The hallway outside the hearing room filled with the specific, compressed energy of a proceeding that has just produced consequences that people are still calculating. Dunmore was on his phone before he reached the door. Fenn's union attorney was on his phone. The county attorney was speaking to Holt in a voice pitched too low to carry past 6 feet. Clea Marsh was writing in her reporter's notebook with the speed and focus of someone trying to capture the exact sequence of events before memory inevitably begins to arrange them more neatly than they actually occurred. Patricia Odom walked toward the building's main exit without stopping, without making eye contact with anyone moving through the crowded hallway, with the efficiency of someone who has said what they came to say and has already moved on to the next step. She passed Nadia on the way. She did not stop. She did not turn her head. But as she passed, precisely calibrated for one person and no one else, she said, "The AG will have a response within the week." She walked out through the main doors. Albright appeared at Nadia's elbow. "You heard that, I heard it. That's faster than I expected." Nadia watched the doors settle closed behind Odom. "They've been watching this county for longer than we have," she said. "We just gave them the piece they needed." Around them, the hallway continued to move attorneys and officials, and a county employee navigating around 3 separate phone conversations with a stack of folders under her arm. All of it. The ordinary machinery of a place that is processing something it had not expected to process today. The gears catching the system, adjusting the shape of things beginning to change in the specific way that things change when the record has been made and can no longer be unmade. A week after the hearing, Albright received an envelope at his office. No return address, postmarked from Remsen County, the neighboring jurisdiction where he had recently confirmed a transfer request filed in December by a Harlow County Sheriff's Office trainee had been approved and processed. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper, a handwritten phone number in careful block letters, and 3 words beneath it. "Ask about Pickett." Albright did not call the number immediately. He recognized the handwriting style of someone who had written carefully, letter by letter, of someone who was not certain they were making the right choice, but was making it anyway. And he understood that pushing too quickly would close a door that had only barely come open. He waited. Meanwhile, in a local Facebook group for Harlow County residents, Destiny 16 Braids, the girl on the bicycle, had posted a 47-second video from her phone. She had not filmed the arrest. She had filmed the cameras first, the one on the pump pillar, then the dome unit under the canopy overhang. She had typed a caption beneath the video. "These were recording. That's all I'm saying." The post was shared 340 times in the first 48 hours. Before Pickett called the platform to file a complaint. The platform did not remove the video. The shares continued. Gerald Hooks, the man in the work truck, the contractor from Macon, who had stood at the far pump with his phone in both hands and put it back in his pocket without pressing record, saw the post on a Thursday evening sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his reading glasses on. He looked at it for a long time. Then he called the Harlow County Ledger and asked for Clea Marsh by name. He told her he had been there. He told her what he had seen. He told her that he had had his phone out and had put it back, and that he had been thinking about that decision ever since, and that he was telling her now because telling her now was the only thing left that he could actually do about it. Marsh added his account to her story. The story was now substantially larger than the one she had begun building in August. 3 weeks after the envelope arrived, Albright called the phone number. It rang 4 times. A voicemail answered a young man's voice, giving only a first name. Albright left a message. Calvin Ware, the trainee who had said Nadia's name carefully in a hallway on the night of November 9th, who had transferred to Remsen County in December, who had sent an envelope with 3 words and a phone number and no return address, called Albright back on a Tuesday afternoon. The call lasted 19 minutes. Albright recorded it with Ware's consent. Ware had been in the administrative building on the afternoon of November 9th. He had been on the afternoon shift. He had heard Fenn in the back hallway in conversation with someone else, a voice he did not recognize, not Cobb, and he had not been able to hear the content. But he had seen Fenn come out of that hallway and go to his locker and come out with an evidence bag empty with something written on the label. He had watched Fenn put the bag back in his locker without placing anything inside it. An evidence bag. Labeled, empty, filed away. Albright called Nadia after. "You were right," he said. "He's moving. Tell him she said that what he saw fills a gap, and tell him that was the right thing to do." The response from the Georgia Attorney General's Civil Rights Unit arrived exactly 1 week after the hearing addressed to the Harlow County Board of Supervisors, with copies to Captain Holt's 2A Division and the presiding officer of the county civil court. It was 4 paragraphs, each one more consequential than the last, in the particular way of formal legal language, which builds its meaning through accumulation rather than drama. The first paragraph identified the matter: the internal affairs complaint, the hearing panel's preliminary findings, the referral. The second paragraph stated that the Civil Rights Unit of the Georgia Attorney General's office was opening a preliminary inquiry into the operational patterns of the Harlow County Sheriff's Office, with particular attention to vehicle stops, detentions, and property handling procedures during the period January 2019 through the current date. The third paragraph stated that a representative of the AG's office would be contacting the county manager's office to arrange access to departmental records, and that full cooperation was expected under the relevant Georgia Code. The fourth paragraph noted in the careful language of a body that cannot yet say what it has not yet proven that the inquiry did not constitute a formal finding of wrongdoing, but represented the initiation of a fact-finding process whose scope would be determined by the evidence. The letter was signed by the First Deputy AAG. Patricia Odom's name was not on it because that was standard. Observers do not sign the letters that result from what they observe. What was not standard was the speed. A week from referral to formal inquiry opening was in Albright's experience approximately 8 weeks faster than he had ever seen it happen. They had a file already on Harlow County. Nadia told him when he called to tell her the letter had been made public. The pattern was already there. The preliminary work was already done. We gave them a documented incident with a witness who was writing it down from the beginning. Clea Marsh's story ran in the Harlow County Ledger the same week, 22 column inches above the fold, a second section inside. The headline read, "Pattern of Stops, 5 Years of Civil Rights Complaints in Harlow County." The story named Cobb. It named Fenn. It named Pickett. It did not name Nadia. It did not yet print the voicemail, which was still pending in the AG's inquiry and not part of the public record, because Marsh was a careful reporter who understood the difference between what she knew and what she could print. The story cited the IIA preliminary findings, quoted the dispatch logs, quoted the AG's inquiry letter. By Friday, the story had been picked up by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and the Associated Press. By the following Monday, the county manager's office had issued a statement about transparency and accountability that used the word committed 4 times. Councilman Ray Doyle issued his own statement expressing confidence in the investigative process, and then stopped attending county council meetings citing scheduling conflicts. His chief of staff sent an email to the county manager's office. The councilman's office will be fully cooperative with any AG inquiries related to county operations. The email was forwarded to Albright through a source he did not identify to Nadia. She did not ask. The weeks between the hearing and the Board of Supervisors meeting had their own momentum, the particular gathering speed of a situation that has passed a threshold and cannot return to the equilibrium that existed before it crossed it. Pickett retained an attorney, civil matters not criminal, which told Albright something specific about where Pickett believed his exposure was concentrated. The attorney signaled Pickett might be willing to provide a voluntary statement to the AG's inquiry, in exchange for immunity from criminal referral for the events of November 9th specifically. He wanted immunity for leaving a voicemail. The AG was considering it. A cooperative Pickett giving a full statement names dates years. The arrangement that preceded every one of the 14 incidents in the preliminary file was not a good outcome for Cobb. It was not a terrible outcome for the people those 14 incidents had happened to. Nadia had been in this position before, the position of watching a complicated process produce outcomes that were simultaneously more and less than what justice would look like in a simpler world. And she had learned across 4 states and 9 years that the product being manufactured in moments like this was not perfect resolution. It was foundation. It was the record on which the next step could be built by someone else in a proceeding that would outlast any one person's involvement toward a conclusion that would eventually arrive, even if it arrived slowly. The Board of Supervisors was meeting in June. Calvin Ware gave his statement to the AG's inquiry office on the second Thursday in April in a conference room in Remsen County that had been arranged through Albright's office because Ware had made it clear with the quiet firmness of someone who had thought about this carefully that he would not be returning to Harlow County for any reason connected to this matter. Not yet. He was not ready for that, and the people asking did not push him because the people asking understood that testimony offered freely is worth more than testimony extracted. He told them what he had told Albright on the phone the afternoon shift. The back hallway. Fenn's voice and one other voice he didn't recognize, the locker, the evidence bag, the label written on nothing. He told it in order without elaboration, without the kind of dramatic framing that a person uses when they are performing credibility rather than simply telling what they saw. He had the quality of someone telling a simple, factual story about something that had happened to him because that was what it was. Albright called Nadia afterward. He was good, he said, very clear, very specific. What else did he say? The bag. He described the label. He couldn't read the full text from where he was standing, but he saw it was a standard evidence documentation label, the kind the department prints with a case reference number and an item description field. She was quiet for a moment. So Fenn had already written the item description. That's what it sounds like. She thought about the intake property log, its triple absence, the careful removal of the rental agreement from every record that should have contained it. And she thought about the person who had done that work, the kind of institutional knowledge required to make something disappear from 3 separate records simultaneously and make each absence look like an oversight rather than a choice. Fenn was a deputy in his mid-20s who had been on the force for 3 years. He had not learned to do that on his own. "Is Ware willing to give a statement to the DA's office?" she asked. "Not yet." He said, "AG inquiry, not DA. He's not there yet. He'll get there," she said. "Give him time." Meanwhile, Pickett's cooperation agreement with the AG's inquiry moved forward through April and into May with the particular slowness of negotiations in which one party holds most of the leverage, and the other is trying to determine exactly how much of what they know they can trade for exactly how much of what they fear. By mid-May, the AG's office had reached an agreement Pickett would provide a full voluntary statement covering the entire history of his arrangement with Cobb, going back to 2019 names, dates, the specifics of how the calls were made, and what was communicated in exchange for immunity from criminal referral for the events of November 9th specifically. The broader pattern and any liability that might attach to his role in the other 13 incidents remained in the inquiry and was not covered. Albright called Nadia the day the agreement was finalized. "Pickett is going to tell them everything he said, everything about the arrangement, everything he knows." She sat with that for a moment. Pickett talking openly, voluntarily under the protection of an immunity agreement meant that the arrangement between him and Cobb, the one that had been operating since before any of the 14 documented incidents, The one that had never been written down because it had never needed to be was now going to be written down in an AG inquiry file. It was going to become a document. And once it became a document, it would be in the record, and the record did not disappear. "What about Gerald Hooks?" she asked. Clea Marsh's follow-up story, the one that included Hooks's account, had run the week after the AG letter, and his name was in the paper now in print, which meant he had made the decision to be part of the record in a way that could not be undone. Albright had heard that Hooks had read his own name in the ledger 3 times and then called his daughter in Atlanta. "He's talking to Marsh again," Albright said. "He's writing a letter." "To whom?" "To the paper. About what it means to see something and not say anything, and then wish you had." She looked out the window of her office, the parking garage, the gray concrete levels, the particular anonymity of a structure whose only function is to hold things in place until they move on. "Let him write it," she said. "It matters." "Does he know that he's writing it?" she said. "He already knows." The Harlow County Board of Supervisors met on the first Tuesday of June, and the agenda item regarding Sheriff Cobb's status was listed 7th of 14, between a discussion of the county road maintenance budget and an update on the school district's summer program funding. It was the only item that caused 41 people to drive to a building that seated 28 comfortably and stand along the walls in the June heat, fanning themselves with agendas waiting. The board was chaired by County Manager Ted Pryor, who had been in the role for 9 years and had developed over that time the specific institutional skill of navigating between competing pressures without visibly committing to any of them, the talent, as Albright had once described it, of threading between fires without catching. He would choose on this day to stop threading. Pete Dunmore spoke for Cobb, who was not present on the advice of counsel. Dunmore made the arguments he had been making in every forum for 7 months: professional judgment routine, community contacts, documentation error, and they sounded in this room the way arguments sound when they have been repeated, past the point where repetition can help them. 2 of the 5 supervisors read sections of the IIA formal written determination aloud carefully, in the deliberate cadence of people who want the words on record in a public space and spoken out loud. After 40 minutes, the board voted 4-1. Cobb's suspension was extended. A formal removal hearing would be scheduled within 90 days. The dissenting vote was Supervisor Glenn Pruitt, who had known Cobb since his first election and who issued a statement afterward saying the process had moved too quickly and been shaped by outside pressure. He had known Cobb since before Cobb had a badge. He would vote again in October. Afterward, a woman approached Ted Pryor in the hallway outside the meeting room. She was in her late 60s, wearing a cardigan in June, and she was holding a photograph, a snapshot, a personal photograph, the kind kept in a wallet. She had a daughter, she told him, who had been stopped near the gas station in 2021, charged with vehicle theft, and had watched the charge dismissed 60 days later, with no explanation and no apology. She had never understood what happened. Her daughter had never understood it, and she had not known that anyone was counting, that anyone had been building a file that her daughter's name was somewhere in a list of 14 until she read about it in Clea Marsh's story. "I saw her name in that determination," the woman said. "I didn't know anyone was keeping track." Pryor had no words equal to the moment. She did not appear to need him to have any. She pressed the photograph gently into his hand and walked away, and he stood in the hallway holding it, looking at the image of a young woman he did not know, and the weight of what the photograph represented, all the things that had happened in this county, that no one had been counting until someone started counting, settled onto him the way things settle when you can no longer pretend not to feel them. Albright called Nadia with the vote count. She was on the highway driving hands at 10-2. 4-1, he said. She drove for a moment in silence. 4-1. Glenn Pruitt voted against it. "He'll come around," she said. And then quietly 4 supervisors voted for it in a county where 2 of them have known Cobb since his first term. That's not a formality. That's something. It is. Albright agreed. It was earned, she said. Not given. Earned by body cam footage and dispatch logs and an 11-second voicemail and a notebook bought in a pack of 3. She kept driving. The Georgia highway ran straight ahead of her, the same road that ran through every county like this one, all the way back to Atlanta and beyond, and she drove it the way she drove all roads, with her hands steady and her eyes on what was coming, and her mind already on the work that remained. The formal removal hearing, she said. 90 days. At most. Probably October. And then however long the hearing takes. And Dunmore will file more motions. He'll file more motions, Albright confirmed. He'll keep filing until the room runs out of patience for it. I know, she said. That's how it works. She paused. It's enough for today, Jerome. 4-1 is enough for today. 2 months after the board vote in the middle of August, Destiny's Facebook post made its way through the particular unpredictable geography of shared content to an investigator working the Harlow County file at the AG's office. Someone in a civil rights network had screenshotted it. Someone else had forwarded it. It arrived in the investigator's inbox on a Monday morning with a note attached. This is the gas station. Those cameras are still there. The investigator filed a request for the Brixton fuel stop surveillance footage from the afternoon of November 9th. All 3 cameras. Pickett, whose attorney had counseled full cooperation as a condition of the immunity agreement, did not object. The footage was handed over within the week. The dome camera under the canopy overhang the one that Nadia had located by the angle of Pickett's shadow and had never looked at directly, the one that appeared in no official document. The one that no one in the department had thought to request had captured the entire interaction from above, at an angle that complemented the pump pillar camera and partially filled in what the pillar camera's position had partially blocked. It showed Cobb's reach toward the bag strap. It showed Nadia's rotation. It showed Fenn's forearm and her knee against the running board. It showed her hands going flat on the hood of the cruiser, and her eyes finding the pump pillar camera and holding there, looking straight into it as the cuffs went on behind her. Nadia was shown a still frame extracted from that footage by Albright several weeks later. She looked at it for a long time, the overhead angle, the warm light of a November afternoon, her own posture in the image, hands flat and open eyes forward. She had not known in that moment on the hood of the cruiser that a camera above her head was capturing what the one she was looking at could not fully see. She had simply known that she was looking into a camera, and that the camera was recording and that the record mattered. Clea Marsh requested an interview with Destiny for a follow-up story in September. Destiny was 17 by then, and she considered the request for 3 days before she agreed, because she had not thought of herself as someone who was part of this story. She had only filmed 2 cameras. She came to the interview in an oversized jacket and braids, and she sat in the plastic chair in the Ledger's small conference room and said carefully that she hadn't known what was happening that day at the gas station exactly, but that it had felt wrong, and that the cameras were right there, and that she had wanted someone to know the cameras were there. "Did you know what you were doing when you filmed them?" Marsh asked. Destiny thought about it. "Not really," she said. "I just knew it seemed like it mattered." Marsh ran the interview in full. The quote, "I just knew it seemed like it mattered," became the pull quote on the front page, and it was picked up by 3 other outlets. And it was the sentence that Gerald Hooks read aloud to his daughter on the phone that evening, his voice doing something his daughter had never quite heard it do before. "She was 16, his daughter said. "She was on her bicycle," he said. "She saw something and she didn't look away." The formal removal hearing for Sheriff Harlan Cobb was scheduled for October 6th, and the crowd in the parking lot of the Harlow County Administrative Building that morning was visible from Highway 9, which had not been true of any county meeting in the living memory of anyone who regularly attended them. 58 people filled the hearing room. 14 more stood in the overflow hallway with a speaker feed piped through a small monitor mounted above the door. 9 others stood outside in the October chill, some with coffee, most without listening to what they could hear through the glass. Nadia was not there. She was in Atlanta. She had submitted her testimony through a written declaration notarized and filed through Albright's office because there was nothing her physical presence in that room could accomplish. That the documentation could not accomplish more effectively and without the complications that come with a principal witness being present in a proceeding where the record has already been made. She had spent the day at her desk. She had eaten lunch at her desk. She had not turned on the television. Albright called her at 7:18 p.m. She was in her apartment, not at the office, sitting in her kitchen at the table with a cup of tea she had made an hour ago and forgotten to drink. She picked up the phone on the first ring. "Tell me," she said. 5-0, he said. She sat with that for a moment, both hands around the cold cup. 5-0. Glenn Pruitt voted with the others. She was very still. He voted. He didn't speak. He just raised his hand. She thought about Glenn Pruitt's hand going up in a room full of people who were watching it. The supervisor who had called the process politically motivated, who had issued a statement about outside pressure, who had known Cobb since before Cobb had a badge, who had been the single dissenting vote in June, raising his hand in October, because by October the record had made not raising it impossible. Not because he had changed his mind about Cobb, perhaps, but because the record had grown to the point where the cost of not raising his hand had simply exceeded whatever other calculations he had been making. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, one of the most significant things she had seen in 9 years of this work, not the unanimous vote itself, but the specific meaning of that fifth hand, the one that had been the holdout, the one that had needed the record to get heavier before it could move. "Fen," she asked. "Termination hearing next month," Albright told her. The union was still fighting it, but the IIA determination was solid, and Ware's statement to the AG inquiry had been shared with the termination panel as permitted by the administrative code. Fenn would probably resign before the formal hearing, collect a partial pension quietly through his attorney, and the rental agreement would remain missing. Destroyed most likely in the hours after Fenn pocketed it by someone who had done it before, and had watched the disappearance hold across case after case, and had not anticipated a situation in which someone was writing things down faster than the disappearance could travel. "Pickett," she asked. The AG's inquiry had Pickett's full statement, now dates, names, the calls, the arrangement that went back to 2019. The pattern before the pattern that the preliminary file had already documented. All of it on record. In exchange for immunity from criminal referral for that specific afternoon. The broader question, the other 13 incidents, the other 13 women remained in the inquiry. It was not resolved. It was documented, which was the necessary condition for eventual resolution. The voicemail, Albright said. "It's going into the full inquiry record, full transcript carrier authentication, complete chain of custody." The voicemail, she said, looking out the window at Atlanta at night. The city moving in its indifferent illuminated way is the spine of all of it. Everything else builds on it. A pause. "He left it because he thought it was temporary," she said. "A voicemail you delete after the return call comes through. He didn't know the carriers keep the metadata. He didn't know the backup system existed." She was quiet for a moment. "He thought I would drive away without the rental agreement and it would be gone, like the others." "But you wrote it down," Albright said. "Before it happened. Before I got out of the car," she said. There was a long silence between them. Not an uncomfortable one, but the kind of silence that exists between two people who have both been carrying the same weight and who are for a moment simply setting it down and looking at what it is. "The DA," she said finally. "Still reviewing." Ware's statement to the AG inquiry had been noted, and Albright believed it had accelerated the timeline, but reviewing was still the word the DA's office was using, and reviewing meant not yet. She knew what that meant. She had been in 4 other counties across 9 years, and she knew the distance between reviewing and acting, and she knew that it was not measured in weeks. "Is it enough for today?" Albright asked. The question was simple, and he meant it simply. She thought about the 5-0 vote. She thought about Glenn Pruitt's hand. She thought about the dispatch log with its clean return sitting in a filing cabinet across from the incident report that described the vehicle status as unclear. 2 documents side by side telling 2 different stories, one of them true. She thought about the body cam footage Fenn's hand, the fold, the pocket. She thought about Calvin Ware, who had transferred counties and kept a phone number and 3 words on a piece of paper, and had eventually on a Tuesday afternoon in April made a 19-minute call that he'd been building toward since November. She thought about Destiny on the bicycle filming 2 cameras with her phone because it seemed like it mattered. She thought about Gerald Hooks at his kitchen table reading his own name in a newspaper calling his daughter. She thought about the 14 women in the preliminary file, the ones who had stopped at the same pump island, the same station, who had not been writing things down. Not because they hadn't been paying attention, but because they had not known when they pulled off the highway that they were going to need to start before anything happened. She had known, because it was her job to know. And that gap between knowing and not knowing, between the accident of training and the accident of being in the wrong county on the wrong afternoon, was something she had never been fully able to make peace with and probably never would. She picked up the cup of cold tea. "Yes," she said. "It's enough for today." November arrived exactly 1 year after the afternoon at Brixton Fuel Stop, and the things that had been set in motion 12 months earlier were still moving. The way large things move, not quickly, not cleanly, but with the particular permanence of objects that have gathered enough mass to continue regardless of what any single person does or doesn't do. Fenn resigned on November 4th. His attorney submitted the paperwork at 9 a.m. The resignation letter, which became public through a records request filed by Clea Marsh the same day it was submitted, cited personal reasons and a desire to pursue opportunities in a different field, and it ran to 2 paragraphs, the second of which was shorter than the first. He retained a partial pension. The rental agreement was not in the letter, which was not surprising, because the rental agreement was not anywhere at all. It had been destroyed, most likely in the hours after Fenn put it in his locker, without putting anything into the evidence bag he had already labeled for it, by someone who understood what its absence from the record would mean, if anyone ever looked carefully enough. The question of who had told him to do it, or whether anyone had told him, or whether he had made the decision himself in a back hallway, based on what he understood to be the arrangement and what the arrangement required, was still open. It was in the inquiry file. It was being examined. It would take time. Ware called Albright 2 weeks later and said he was ready to give a statement to the DA's office, not the AG's office, not the IIA division, the DA. The language of criminal referral. Albright called Nadia immediately. "He's moving," she said. "DA's office. He'll go in next week." She was quiet for a moment. "Good. Don't let it sit." The Board of Supervisors' formal removal proceeding took 3 additional months. Dunmore filed 2 more motions, both of which were denied by the outside counsel the board had retained from Savannah, and a 3rd motion that was still technically pending when the board voted in January. The vote was 5-0 again. Harlan Cobb became the first Harlow County Sheriff removed from office in 31 years. His statement, issued through Dunmore, said he maintained that he had acted within the scope of his authority and would pursue all available legal avenues. The appeal was filed in civil court 11 days later. It would take time. Destiny, now 17, was invited to speak at a Harlow County community meeting in December, organized by a group of residents who had been showing up to every county meeting since the board's June vote. She did not want to speak. She said she had only filmed 2 cameras. The organizer said that was enough. She went. She stood at the microphone in a community center on the north end of Harlow with 70 people watching her, and she stood there for 11 seconds without saying anything because she was trying to find the right words and couldn't, and then she gave up looking for the right words and said the only word she had. "If the cameras are there, use them." She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment, and then a woman in the second row began to clap, and then the room followed. Gerald Hooks's letter ran in the Harlow County Ledger on the third Thursday of November on the front page below the fold. It was 2 paragraphs. The first explained who he was and where he had been standing on the afternoon of November 9th. The second paragraph read, in full, "I had my phone in my hand and I put it back in my pocket. I told myself it wasn't my business. I drove away. I've thought about that every week since then. I'm saying something now because saying something now is the only thing I can still actually do about it. Better late than right, but at least late." It became the most read piece the Ledger published that year. Marsh called him after it ran. He didn't have much to say. He just said he hoped it helped somebody. The woman whose daughter had been stopped in 2021, the one who had pressed the photograph into Ted Pryor's hand, outside the board meeting in June, was contacted by the AG's inquiry office in October. Her daughter's name was in the file. The inquiry needed a statement from her if she was willing. She was hesitant at first because the charge had been dismissed, and she had spent 3 years trying to convince her daughter that it was over and to move past it, and she wasn't sure that opening it again was something she had the right to ask her daughter to do. And then she thought about the 11-second voicemail which Marsh had finally printed in full after it entered the public record in September, and she thought about the woman who had pulled into a gas station with a rental car and a notebook, and had written everything down before anything happened, and she called the AG's office back and said they would both give a statement. The body camera policy for Harlow County mandatory activation from the moment of first contact cloud backup with automatic authentication monthly audits by a third-party administrator was approved by the County Council in December with a budget line that was funded in full for the first time in the policy's 3-year history of being discussed and deferred. The policy had been discussed and deferred in 2021 and again in 2022, each time reaching the budget stage and being reduced to a study committee. In December of this year, it was not reduced, and there was no study committee. Something had changed in the way that things change when the cost of not changing has become visible enough that the people responsible for the decision can no longer claim not to see it. Albright called Nadia when the budget vote was confirmed. "Body camera policy," he said. "Funded in full. It's a start," she said. "A real start." "Yes," she said. "A real one." She hung up. She sat at her desk in Atlanta in her office with the window that faced the parking garage, and she thought about 14 women over 5 years at the same Pump Island, and about the body camera policy that had been deferred twice, and about what the difference was between this December and the 2 Decembers before it. The difference was a file. The difference was a record. The difference was documentation that could not be unmade testimony that had been given a labeled evidence bag filled with nothing, and an 11-second voicemail that a man had left in the absolute certainty that it would disappear. She opened the new file on her desk, a different county, a different highway, a different pattern waiting since February. She turned to the first page. She picked up her pen. She had been back at her desk since the week after the hearing in March, because that was how the work went. You completed your part of it. You transferred what you had built to the hands of the people whose part came next, and you went back to the desk and started again. The field assessment was filed. The documentation had been transmitted. The case had moved into a phase that belonged to other people. Now the AG's inquiry, the DA's review, the board proceedings, the slow institutional machinery that turns individual events into records, and records into policy, and policy eventually into the kind of change that is too distributed and too gradual to point to, but that is real nonetheless. She had a new file open. She had had it open since February, when it had arrived on her desk from the coordinating office in Savannah with a cover memo that described the preliminary pattern and the preliminary concerns and the preliminary questions that required a field assessment to answer. A different county, a different highway, a different set of names in a different preliminary file that had been assembled by the same kind of careful, patient, months-long work that had produced the Harlow County file by people who had been doing this long enough to know what a pattern looked like before it became a documented incident. But before she opened the new file that morning, she had looked at the notebook. It was the old one, the one from Harlow County, black cover, spiral bound, the kind sold in packs of 3. She had filled 44 pages. She had not counted them when she finished. She had simply set the notebook in the drawer and opened a new one. But she had taken it out this morning and set it on the desk, and she was looking at it now in the gray November light coming through the window. She opened it to the first entry, the one she had written before she stepped out of the car, before anything had happened. Before Dwayne Pickett came outside with his thumbs in his waistband, before the loudspeaker crackled, before any of it. Brixton Fuel Stop Highway 9, Harlow County, Georgia. 2:47 p.m. Odometer, 51,883. Below it, the second entry, 2:52 p.m. Pickett. Phone call. Turned away. Under 30 seconds. One line written before anything went wrong. Written before anything had even started. Written because she had learned across 4 states and 9 years in rooms and county buildings and parking lots, very similar to this one, that the only way to document what happened was to start before it happened. Because if you waited until something was wrong, you had already lost the first minutes. And the first minutes were always where the arrangement revealed itself most clearly, in the space between the call and the arrival, in the 13-minute gap between a clean dispatch response and a cruiser pulling to a stop 6 feet away. She had known to start writing because it was her job to know. She had that knowledge because she had been trained, because she had years of experience, because she had been placed in that situation with that preparation deliberately as part of an 8-month investigation that had been building toward exactly this kind of documented incident. The 14 women in the preliminary file had not had that preparation. They had pulled off the same highway, stopped at the same pump island, encountered the same man with the same arrangement and the same unhurried pace, and they had not been writing things down. Not because they were not paying attention. They had been paying attention, every one of them, the way you pay attention when something is wrong, but because they had not known, when they pulled off the interstate and saw a gas station and thought nothing of stopping, that they needed to start writing before they got out of the car. That asymmetry between knowing and not knowing, between the accident of training and the accident of being in the wrong county on the wrong afternoon, was not something she had ever resolved, and she did not try to resolve it now. She simply held it the way you hold things that don't have resolutions, and she looked at the first entry in the notebook, and she thought about the 44 pages that followed it and what they had become. She turned to the last entry, the one she had written on the morning of November 10th, sitting in the driver's seat of the returned Traverse in the administrative building parking lot before she started the engine. "They don't know what I have?" She closed the notebook. She set it back in the drawer. She opened the new file, the one from February, the different county, the different highway, and she read the cover memo and the preliminary pattern summary and the list of preliminary questions that needed field assessment to answer, and she made 3 margin notes in the clean, slightly slanted handwriting that she had used for everything she had ever written down, and then she reached for the new notebook. Black cover. Spiral bound, the same Model 3 for $1, and she opened it to the first page. She wrote today's date. She wrote the time. She wrote the name of the county, the name of the highway, the name of the gas station that appeared in the preliminary file as the most likely point of contact, based on the pattern and the geography and 8 months of careful, patient, invisible work by people who understood what they were looking at. She wrote the odometer reading from this morning's drive to the office. She capped the pen. She looked at the window, the parking garage, the gray levels of concrete, the November light that came through in flat, neutral sheets and illuminated nothing dramatically and everything equally, and she thought about where she was going and about what she would find when she got there, and about all the things she would need to write down before anything happened. Her phone rang. She picked it up on the first ring. Brixton Fuel Stop was still open. The pumps ran the same as they always had. Pickett's name was still above the door, the paint slightly more faded now than it had been in November, The hand-painted "No Loitering" sign still there, the canopy still sagging at the same corner, the general atmosphere of a place that had made its peace with the passage of time entirely unchanged. But the cameras were different. Both of them, the one on the pump pillar and the one mounted near the entrance, had been replaced in February, upgraded, as part of a preliminary civil settlement agreement that the county had signed without admitting liability, which was how counties sign things when they understand what the alternative is. The new cameras ran on a digital system with cloud backup that auto-authenticated every hour, and that could not be disabled from the register or from anywhere else on the property. And the dome camera under the canopy overhang the hemisphere unit on the south-facing side. The one that Nadia had found by the angle of a man's shadow, and had never looked at directly, the one that appeared in no official document until Destiny's video led an investigator to request the footage, had also been upgraded quietly without fanfare as a separate line item in the same agreement. The man who installed the new system drove in from 2 counties away and drove back the same day. He did not know the history of the place. He only knew what the contract specified: 3 cameras, cloud-authenticated, no local override. He did the job and left, and the cameras began recording from the moment they were switched on, and they did not stop. Calvin Ware drove an hour to give his statement to the DA's office on a Thursday morning in November in civilian clothes in a conference room in Harlow that he had agreed to return to because Albright had told him, and he had believed that testimony given in the place where the thing happened carries a particular weight. He was not nervous. He had spent several months becoming not nervous by the gradual process of deciding that what he had seen mattered more than what it might cost him. He told them about the hallway, the locker, the evidence bag, the label written on nothing. He told it in order. He drove home afterward and called his mother, and he did not tell her what the statement was about. He only told her that he had done something that needed doing, and that he felt okay about it, which was true. Destiny, now 17, posted a new photograph on her social media that same week, just herself at school, caught mid-laugh in the hallway by a friend's phone, and she captioned it with one word: louder. 400 people shared it within a day, most of them not knowing the specific reason it felt right, only that it did. Gerald Hooks still drove the same truck on the same routes, still stopped at gas stations the same way he always had. But now, when something didn't look right, he took out his phone. He didn't always record, but he always looked. He had told his daughter about the letter he'd written and about what she'd said in response. You were there, and you didn't look away at the end. That's what counts, and he kept that sentence with him the way you keep sentences that have the weight of being exactly right. In a filing cabinet in a federal office in Atlanta, inside a folder labeled with a case number and a date, the first item in the chain of custody index was a copy of a rental agreement. Not the original. The original was gone destroyed in a back hallway on the evening of November 9th by someone who had understood what its absence from the record would mean and had acted on that understanding without hesitation in the absolute confidence that the disappearance would hold the way it had always held in case after case for 5 years, for 14 women for every stop at that pump island that had ended the same way until the afternoon it didn't. But the copy, Nadia's copy, the one she had kept when she offered the original, and it was taken without a receipt, the one she had folded twice and held in her hand on the hood of the cruiser while she looked into the camera. The copy was in the file, and the file was in the record, and the record did not disappear. Because that was the one thing about records that no one who tried to use disappearance as a tool ever fully understood, that you can make the original vanish, but you cannot make the copy vanish if the person holding the copy started writing before you knew they were there. Somewhere on a Georgia highway right now, there is a woman with her hands at 10 and 2 and a new notebook open on the center console, and she is writing down the time and the location and the odometer reading before she pulls off the exit, before she reaches the pump, before anything has happened yet. Because that is how you do it. You start before it starts. You write it down. You look into the camera, because the camera is there, because someone put it there and it is recording. And the record is the thing that outlasts all of it. The arrangement, the gap, the pocket, the silence. The 31 years of the same man in the same chair and the same walk across the same parking lot, and the same expectation that no one will be writing it down. The record outlasts all of it. It always has. Her phone is ringing one ring and she picks it up and she says, "I'm ready. Send me the next file." If this story moved you, please like and share it and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story that needs to be told.